I've often observed that the human psyche suffers most intensely not in moments of obvious deprivation, but in moments where suffering appears unjustified. When life is externally fine, when stability, routine, and social approval are present, the mind loses its most convenient explanations for discomfort. In such conditions, emptiness emerges not as a dramatic pain, but as a quiet disturbance that confuses the ego, because it cannot easily point to a cause. In these cases, the individual comes to me saying, "Nothing is wrong, and yet something feels missing." This statement already reveals the conflict. The ego insists on measuring well-being through visible markers, work, relationships, productivity, while the unconscious speaks in a different language, one that does not obey logic or gratitude. The emptiness is not a failure of appreciation. It is a signal that external adequacy does not guarantee internal harmony. I would argue that when material or social needs are sufficiently met, the psyche loses its distractions. Desire, no longer occupied with survival or pursuit, turns inward. What then surfaces is not always pleasure, but the unresolved residues of earlier conflicts, postponed questions, and forbidden wishes that were never allowed expression. The mind becomes quiet enough for what was buried to make itself felt, though not yet understood. This paradox troubles the modern individual deeply because it contradicts the promise implicit in achievement. One is taught, implicitly and explicitly, that fulfillment follows success, stability, and recognition. When this promise fails, the ego experiences confusion rather than clarity. Emptiness appears not as a wound, but as a void where satisfaction was expected to reside. What is often overlooked is that the psyche does not operate on accumulation. It operates on meaning, tension, and movement. When life becomes organized solely around maintenance, keeping things running, preserving order, avoiding disruption, the psychic apparatus loses its sense of direction. Desire does not vanish, but it becomes disoriented, unable to attach itself to conscious goals. In such states, the individual may continue functioning flawlessly while feeling increasingly detached from their own experience. They wake, act, perform, and relate, yet everything feels strangely distant, as if lived through glass. This distance is not numbness in the clinical sense, but a subtle withdrawal of psychic investment, what I would recognize as libido no longer flowing toward conscious life. This withdrawal does not occur without reason. The psyche does not abandon engagement arbitrarily. Often it retreats because engagement once carried a cost: disappointment, loss, rejection, or emotional overwhelm. When these early experiences remain unresolved, the mind learns that full investment is dangerous. Having everything then becomes less a triumph and more a controlled environment where nothing truly risky is allowed. From here, emptiness begins to resemble safety rather than absence. The individual may not yet recognize this, but the feeling of hollowness is already performing a function. It limits emotional exposure. And it is precisely this quiet, defensive function that leads us naturally toward the next layer of the problem: how normality itself can become a disguise for repression. When I hear someone describe themselves as fine, I listen carefully to what is absent rather than what is present. To feel fine is often to feel contained, regulated, and acceptable. Yet psychological health is not synonymous with emotional containment. Many individuals mistake emotional control for emotional well-being, unaware that what they experience as stability may in fact be the result of a long-standing internal restriction. Repression does not announce itself dramatically. It works quietly, efficiently, and often successfully. The mind learns early which feelings threaten attachment, approval, or safety. Desire that leads to disappointment, anger that risks rejection, grief that overwhelms the caregivers around the child. These emotions are gradually pushed away, not because they disappear, but because they become inconvenient for survival. Over time, the ego builds an identity around manageability. The individual becomes someone who is easy, calm, rational, or low maintenance. This identity is rewarded by the social world, reinforcing the belief that emotional suppression is maturity. What is rarely noticed is that each excluded emotion leaves behind not peace, but a small vacancy in the inner world. Emptiness, in this sense, is not the absence of emotion, but the absence of access. The feelings still exist, stored within the unconscious, exerting pressure without words. Because they are not permitted conscious expression, they no longer appear as recognizable emotions. Instead, they return as a vague sense of flatness, fatigue, or disconnection that the individual cannot logically explain. The calm surface becomes convincing. Even the individual believes it. They say, "I don't feel sad, I don't feel anxious, I don't feel angry," assuming this neutrality is evidence of balance. Yet the psyche is not designed for neutrality. When affect is chronically restricted, vitality diminishes. Life continues, but its texture thins. What troubles the ego most is that repression works. It prevents emotional chaos, interpersonal conflict, and inner turbulence. For this reason, the mind becomes invested in maintaining it. Letting go of repression feels less like healing and more like danger, because it threatens to release emotions that were once experienced as unmanageable. This creates a peculiar dilemma. The individual longs to feel alive, yet fears the intensity that aliveness might bring. Emptiness becomes a compromise between pain and vitality. It is tolerable, predictable, and socially invisible. The psyche chooses hollowness over risk, even if it does not consciously frame the choice this way. As repression continues, something else begins to shift. Desire itself starts to fade from conscious awareness, not because it no longer exists, but because wanting has been associated with frustration or loss. The individual stops expecting fulfillment, not out of wisdom, but out of adaptation. And this quiet disappearance of desire leads directly into the next dimension of emptiness, the loss of wanting as a psychological condition rather than an emotional state. I have often insisted that emptiness must not be confused with sadness. Sadness still implies attachment. It still signals that something is wanted, missed, or mourned. Emptiness, however, speaks a different language. It is the silence that follows when the psyche no longer dares to want. In my view, this absence of desire is not a natural state, but a defensive outcome shaped by repeated frustration. Desire becomes dangerous when it is consistently met with disappointment, punishment, or neglect. When longing leads nowhere, or worse, leads to pain, the mind begins to associate wanting with threat. Over time, the psyche learns that it is safer to reduce desire itself than to endure the emotional consequences of its failure. This reduction is not conscious. It unfolds gradually, disguised as maturity, realism, or emotional control. As desire retreats, the individual may describe themselves as content, low expectation, or practical. Yet beneath this surface lies a quiet resignation. The world no longer feels inviting, not because it lacks opportunities, but because the internal impulse to reach toward it has weakened. Life becomes something to manage rather than something to pursue. This numbing of longing does not eliminate inattention. Desire, even when suppressed, continues to exist in the unconscious. What disappears is not the drive itself, but the permission to feel it. The result is a psychic economy in which energy circulates without direction, producing fatigue rather than movement, restlessness rather than passion. In such conditions, the individual may still pursue goals, career, relationships, routines, But these pursuits feel oddly hollow. Achievement does not satisfy and rest does not restore. The ego functions, yet the psyche feels undernourished. This is not a failure of success, but a failure of connection between conscious action and unconscious desire. I would emphasize that this loss of desire often masquerades as stability. The individual is no longer tormented by longing, jealousy, or yearning, and this relief is mistaken for peace. Yet peace achieved through renunciation carries a cost. The capacity for joy diminishes alongside the capacity for pain. Emotional life becomes flattened, reduced to a narrow range of tolerable states. What makes this loss particularly difficult to recognize is its gradual nature. There is no clear moment where desire disappears. Instead, it slowly withdraws from awareness, leaving behind a sense that something essential has gone missing without anyone noticing its departure. The individual adapts to this absence, organizing life around obligation rather than inclination. As desire fades, another shift occurs. The individual increasingly lives according to external expectations, social roles, and prescribed paths, since internal guidance has grown faint. The question, "What do I want?" becomes difficult to answer and is often replaced by, "What should I do?" This transition leads naturally into the next layer of emptiness, when a life is lived not from inner impulse, but from borrowed scripts that belong to someone else. When desire weakens, the psyche does not become directionless, it becomes obedient. In the absence of clear inner impulses, the individual turns outward for guidance. What emerges is a life increasingly shaped by expectations, familial, social, cultural, rather than by authentic inclination. From my perspective, this is not a moral failure, but a structural shift in psychic organization. I would describe this condition as a life governed by the superego. The superego speaks in the language of should, what one should want, should value, should prioritize. It offers certainty and approval, especially to those who have learned that personal desire leads to disappointment or conflict. Over time, the voice of the superego grows louder than the quieter signals of the unconscious drives. The individual may appear successful, responsible, and socially adapted. They follow the expected path, make reasonable choices, and avoid obvious transgressions. Yet beneath this apparent stability lies a persistent sense of detachment. Life feels performed rather than inhabited, as though one is acting out a role written by someone else. This performance often begins early. Children quickly learn which aspects of themselves are welcomed and which are inconvenient. Affection, praise, and safety become contingent upon compliance. The psyche adapts by internalizing these external demands, transforming them into inner rules that continue to operate long after the original authorities are gone. As adulthood unfolds, the individual may no longer recognize these rules as imposed. They feel natural, self-evident, even virtuous. The person believes they are choosing freely, unaware that the framework within which they choose has already been determined. Desire, already weakened, finds little room to reassert itself within such a narrow structure. Emptiness arises here not from lack, but from misalignment. The ego moves efficiently through tasks and obligations, while the unconscious remains largely uninvolved. Psychic energy is expended, but it does not circulate in a way that produces vitality. Life feels full of activity and empty of meaning at the same time. What complicates this state is the fear associated with deviation. To question the life one is living feels dangerous, not because the alternative is unknown, but because it threatens the internal order that has kept emotional chaos at bay. The superego promises safety through conformity, even as it quietly drains life of spontaneity. As this internal arrangement persists, another pattern becomes visible. The individual not only lives according to expectations, but also avoids emotional intensity altogether. Feeling deeply begins to seem unnecessary, risky, or even irresponsible. And it is precisely this avoidance of emotional depth that prepares the ground for the next dimension of emptiness, the fear not of suffering, but of feeling too much. I have long observed that the psyche does not retreat from emotion without reason. When emotional intensity has once exceeded the individual's capacity to contain it, the mind learns to associate feeling with danger. In such cases, emptiness becomes not a failure of emotional life, but a strategy of protection. It is quieter to feel nothing than to risk being overwhelmed again. This fear rarely originates in adulthood. It is shaped early, when the individual first encounters emotions that cannot be processed safely: grief without comfort, anger without boundaries, fear without reassurance. When these experiences occur repeatedly, the psyche draws a simple conclusion: intensity is unsafe. From that moment on, regulation shifts toward restriction rather than integration. Emotional flatness then develops gradually. The individual does not consciously decide to feel less. Instead, the mind narrows the range of permitted experience. Joy is dampened to prevent disappointment. Attachment is limited to prevent loss. Enthusiasm is restrained to avoid collapse. What remains is a tolerable, muted emotional field that feels manageable, if uninspiring. This state is often mistaken for emotional maturity. The person prides themselves on being calm, composed, unaffected. Yet this calmness is not the result of inner stability, but of inner distance. The psyche has learned to keep itself at arm's length from its own depths, observing rather than inhabiting emotional life. The cost of this distance becomes apparent in moments where feeling is unavoidable. When strong emotion breaks through, whether love, grief, or desire, it arrives without preparation. The individual experiences it as intrusive rather than meaningful, reinforcing the belief that emotions are disruptive forces rather than signals to be understood. As a result, the ego invests heavily in control. Thought replaces feeling, explanation replaces experience, and analysis stands in for presence. While this intellectualization offers temporary safety, it further disconnects the individual from the affective core of life. Emptiness deepens, not because emotion is absent, but because access to it is tightly guarded. What remains unacknowledged is that emotional flatness is not neutral. It carries its own form of suffering. Life loses contrast, depth, and resonance. The individual moves through experiences without being fully touched by them, sensing that something essential is missing but unable to identify what has been sacrificed. This sacrifice often traces back to needs that were once expressed and unmet. The psyche learned that longing leads nowhere, that emotional exposure yields no relief. And as this pattern settles, the emptiness that follows begins to echo something older still, a silent record of emotional needs that were never responded to, waiting beneath the surface to be recognized. I have always maintained that childhood does not remain in the past. It persists within the adult psyche, shaping reactions, expectations, and emotional capacities long after its events have faded from conscious memory. When emotional needs are not met early in life, they do not vanish. They lose their words. What remains is not a clear memory of deprivation, but a diffuse sense that something essential is missing. The child depends entirely on others, not only for survival, but for emotional regulation. When fear, sadness, or longing are consistently met with absence, dismissal, or inconsistency, the psyche learns to adapt. It lowers its expectations, reduces its demands, and internalizes the belief that needing is dangerous or futile. This adaptation allows the child to endure, but it quietly reshapes emotional life. As adulthood arrives, the individual may no longer experience these unmet needs as desires. They are not consciously mourned or articulated. Instead, they persist as a background emptiness, a sense of inner vacancy that cannot be filled by success, relationships, or activity. The person feels incomplete without knowing what is missing, because the original need was never symbolized. This is why emptiness often feels older than the present moment. It does not respond to current improvements or changes because its origin lies in a time when emotional fulfillment was not reliably available. The adult attempts to resolve this feeling through external means, unaware that the absence belongs to an internal structure formed long ago. What complicates this dynamic is that emotional neglect is rarely experienced as trauma in the dramatic sense. There may have been no overt abuse, no clear catastrophe. Instead, there was a lack of emotional attunement, a subtle absence of recognition. The psyche struggles to justify its pain because there is no visible wound to point to. As a result, the individual often minimizes their own suffering. They tell themselves that their childhood was fine, that others had it worse, that nothing truly bad happened. This rationalization reinforces the emptiness because it prevents the unmet needs from being acknowledged as real and legitimate. The unconscious, however, does not require justification. It carries the imprint of these early experiences regardless of conscious interpretation. Emotional needs that were never met continue to influence how the individual approaches intimacy, desire, and vulnerability, often leading to a cautious or detached stance toward others. Over time, the psyche learns to function without expecting emotional nourishment. It becomes efficient, independent, and self-contained, yet this very independence carries a quiet cost. The individual no longer feels hungry, but not because they are satisfied, because the hunger itself has been suppressed. And this suppression gradually contributes to another layer of emptiness, one rooted not in longing, but in the exhaustion of constantly managing oneself without support. I have often described the ego as a mediator, endlessly negotiating between instinct, morality, and reality. This task requires energy. When the ego is forced to remain vigilant at all times, containing impulses, regulating emotion, maintaining composure, it becomes fatigued. This fatigue does not always present as stress or anxiety. More often, it manifests as emptiness. To be constantly functional is to live in a state of sustained self-monitoring. The individual learns to anticipate reactions, manage impressions, and suppress impulses before they reach expression. While this creates external stability, it demands continuous psychic effort. The ego is never allowed to rest, never allowed to loosen its grip. This chronic control often develops in response to earlier environments where emotional expression carried consequences. The psyche learns that spontaneity invites conflict, rejection, or chaos. As a result, control becomes synonymous with safety. The ego tightens its hold, believing that vigilance is the only way to prevent collapse. Over time, the suppression of impulse becomes habitual. Desire is filtered before it is felt. Emotion is analyzed before it is experienced, and action is delayed until it is deemed acceptable. Life becomes a series of calculated responses rather than lived moments. The individual remains competent, reliable, and contained, yet increasingly disconnected from any sense of vitality. The emptiness that emerges here is subtle. It does not feel like suffering, but like depletion. The person may describe feeling drained, flat, or disengaged without being able to identify a specific cause. This depletion is the result of an ego that has been overworked, forced to perform tasks that were never meant to be constant. What is often misunderstood is that control itself becomes addictive. The individual comes to rely on it, fearing that any relaxation will unleash something unmanageable. Letting go feels irresponsible, even dangerous. Thus the ego continues its labor, maintaining order at the expense of aliveness. As control dominates psychic life, the capacity for pleasure diminishes. Pleasure requires a certain surrender, a willingness to be affected. When the ego is rigid, this surrender is blocked. Experiences lose their intensity, not because they lack potential, but because the psyche cannot fully engage with them. This persistent state of regulation leaves little room for emotional renewal. The individual functions, but does not feel restored by rest or accomplishment. Emptiness deepens, not through absence, but through overuse. And as this exhaustion continues, the psyche seeks compensation elsewhere, often through stimulation that promises pleasure but delivers only temporary relief, opening the path toward the next layer of the problem. I made a clear distinction between pleasure and satisfaction, though they are often confused in everyday life. Pleasure refers to the immediate reduction of tension, the brief relief that follows stimulation. Satisfaction, however, requires something deeper, the meaningful engagement of desire, the sense that an inner need has been truly met. Modern life excels at producing pleasure, but it rarely offers satisfaction. The contemporary individual is surrounded by stimuli designed to soothe, distract, and excite. Entertainment, consumption, novelty, and constant engagement promise relief from discomfort. Yet these pleasures are fleeting. They calm the psyche momentarily without addressing its underlying tensions. Once the stimulation fades, the emptiness returns, often intensified by the contrast. This pattern teaches the mind to seek relief rather than resolution. The individual learns to silence discomfort quickly instead of listening to it. Desire is redirected away from depth and toward immediacy. What might have become longing, curiosity, or emotional inquiry is converted into consumption, scrolling, or distraction. The problem is not pleasure itself. Pleasure is essential to psychic life. The difficulty arises when pleasure is repeatedly used as a substitute for satisfaction. In such cases, the psyche becomes overstimulated but undernourished. It experiences constant movement without direction, activity without meaning. I observed that when instinctual energy is denied proper expression, it seeks alternative outlets. Modern pleasure offers such outlets, but in a fragmented form. The drives are partially appeased, never fully integrated. This leaves the individual restless, compelled to repeat the cycle, mistaking intensity for fulfillment. Over time, this repetition dulls emotional responsiveness. What once felt pleasurable becomes insufficient. More stimulation is required to achieve the same effect, yet the underlying emptiness remains unchanged. The psyche adapts by lowering its expectations of satisfaction, settling for brief relief instead of enduring fulfillment. This condition creates a peculiar exhaustion. The individual is not deprived of pleasure, yet feels chronically unfulfilled. Life becomes busy, colorful, and stimulating, while something essential feels absent. The emptiness deepens not because pleasure is lacking, but because it never reaches the core of the self. As this pattern continues, the psyche begins to experience a quiet sense of mourning. Something has been lost, though it is difficult to name. It is not the loss of pleasure, but the loss of meaning, of connection between desire and experience. And it is this unrecognized mourning, this grief without an object, that begins to surface beneath the emptiness, shaping the final layer we must examine next. I have often encountered mourning that does not announce itself as grief. It arrives without tears, without memories clearly attached to it, without a name. In such cases, the individual does not say, "I am grieving," but rather, "I feel empty." This emptiness, however, is not the absence of feeling. It is mourning that has lost its object. The psyche is capable of grieving more than people. It mourns possibilities that were never realized, versions of the self that were never allowed to emerge, emotional connections that never fully formed. When these losses are not consciously recognized, they cannot be processed in the usual way. They remain suspended in the unconscious, exerting pressure without representation. This kind of mourning is particularly difficult to detect because nothing visibly ended. There was no clear moment of loss, no farewell, no rupture that demanded acknowledgement. Instead, something slowly faded. Desire, hope, spontaneity, or emotional openness, without anyone noticing its disappearance. The psyche registers the loss even when the ego does not. Because the loss is vague, the grief becomes diffuse. The individual may feel a persistent heaviness or hollowness, unable to explain why life feels diminished. They may search for external causes, assuming something is missing in the present, when in fact something was lost long ago and never mourned. I would emphasize that this unconscious mourning often coexists with a functional life. The person continues working, relating, and achieving, all while carrying a quiet sense of incompleteness. The ego adapts by normalizing the feeling, treating it as part of existence rather than as a response to loss. This unresolved grief also shapes how the individual relates to the future. When mourning remains unconscious, hope becomes risky. To hope is to risk losing again. As a result, expectations are lowered, ambition softens, and desire retreats further. Emptiness becomes a way to avoid reopening wounds that were never fully acknowledged. What remains unspoken is that the psyche seeks resolution, not through forgetting, but through recognition. Grief that is not symbolized does not disappear. It transforms into mood, fatigue, or detachment. The individual feels something weighing on them, yet cannot trace it to a specific memory or event. As this silent mourning persists, the psyche begins to send a different kind of signal. Emptiness starts to feel less like a void and more like a question, an invitation to look inward rather than outward. And it is this shift from emptiness as a condition to emptiness as a message that opens the path toward the final movement we must consider next. I would caution against treating emptiness as a personal flaw or a sign of psychological weakness. The psyche does not generate states without reason. When emptiness appears, it does so as a signal, subtle, persistent, and often misunderstood. It is not an absence of life, but a message that life has been narrowed, restricted, or diverted from its original course. In my view, emptiness emerges when essential parts of the self have been ignored or sacrificed in the name of adaptation. The individual learns early that certain desires, emotions, or impulses are unacceptable, dangerous, or inconvenient. Over time, these elements are pushed out of conscious life, not destroyed, but buried. What remains is a functional surface and an inner silence that feels like nothingness. This silence is often misinterpreted as stability or maturity. People say they are fine and calm or in control without noticing what has been lost in the process. Yet the psyche remembers. Emptiness is the trace left behind when vitality is exchanged for safety, when spontaneity is replaced by compliance, when desire is muted to avoid conflict or disappointment. I would argue that emptiness speaks in the language of negation. It does not announce what is missing directly. Instead, it removes color, intensity, and emotional resonance from experience. Life continues, but without depth. Pleasure feels thin, relationships feel distant, and goals feel strangely irrelevant. This is not failure. It is communication. The ego often resists this message. To acknowledge emptiness is to confront what was repressed, and repression exists precisely to avoid such confrontation. As a result, individuals distract themselves, seek stimulation, or impose productivity, hoping to fill the void rather than listen to it. But emptiness does not ask to be filled. It asks to be understood. When the individual begins to tolerate this state without immediately trying to escape it, something shifts. Emptiness starts to feel less threatening and more informative. Questions arise. What did I give up to become who I am? Which desires were never allowed to mature? Which emotions were judged too dangerous to feel? These questions mark the psyche's movement toward truth. I would emphasize that the goal is not to eliminate emptiness, but to follow it inward. The psyche uses discomfort as a guide. Where there is emptiness, there is often a buried wish, an unexpressed grief, or a disowned part of the self waiting to be reintegrated into conscious life. The signal persists until it is recognized. In this way, emptiness becomes the beginning rather than the end of psychological movement. It is the moment when the psyche stops compensating and starts speaking honestly. And once this message is heard, the individual is no longer merely enduring life, but standing at the threshold of reclaiming what was once lost and quietly waiting to return.